And welcome back, everybody. Hope you're well. We're going to be continuing this series of shows we've been doing on various aspects of some of the missing pieces of what's going on right now, the meltdown of our culture and civilization. And we can't look any further than modern art for great examples of this. And getting into some of Kant, some of Freud, and some of the ideas and the origins of the world of art and where we're at right now. So, Michael, great to see you. Great series so far. Where are we going today?
Yeah. Thanks for that. There's been a bit of a delay, but it's been. Well, people will think it's worth it. Well, talking of delays, this is actually 13 years ago. This has been on the shelf that I wanted to do this and do it right. So big shout out. Thank you to all the members for, again, this is a classic example of one that has just been sitting there, waiting for the right time. You see, the whole thing is, if we're talking about modern art, we're not just talking about modern art. It's not some, diversion. It's not some weird anomaly of our times. Modern art is our times. We are living in modern times or postmodern times where, so the modern art is a feature, a phenomena of modernity. So hopefully what we'll talk about today is going to explain not just modern art, but the whole of modernity. And the thread that I like, because so many people have spoken about this, and it's difficult to encompass in one short podcast or whatever, right? Because arguably there's many threads, but the one that I think makes the most sense, and after so many years of research, not just 13 years, but more like moving up to like 20, 30 years of looking at this, I've chosen a thread that I think is more productive because it really does answer not only the problem of modern art, but of our modern times, and is also philosophical. So really, you couldn't get to this analysis unless you're looking at the philosophy of art. The philosophy of modern art is what we're really going to deal with, especially in terms of origins. Now, what I do is we've been dealing with a little mini series on metaphysics and German idealism. And that's when I thought, we have to, this dovetails with exactly this one that's been on the shelf for all these years. Suddenly I'm glad I remembered it now. Pull that off because it fits as a nice segue into, from what we've been talking about with German idealism. It fits perfectly, actually, because although we spoke about Kant's metaphysics and his transcendental idealism and how that gave rise to the German, expanders that came after him and all of that, there is something that Kant is famous for, probably equally great. Some people, actually, the neo-Kantians, right, the ones who came after him, actually would wave the flag of what we're going to talk about right now. And how it's been referred to, if you go to the first slide, it's referred to, so people can follow up on this, as the second Copernican revolution. Now, what does that mean? This is what's known in philosophy. Well, obviously, the first Copernican revolution is Copernicus himself, Nicola Copernicus, the Polish. I mean, to Poles, he's considered a god, right? And he's the great astronomer, 15th century. So look at the dates. That corresponds with the Renaissance. So when we did Pico della Mirandola, and you're talking about all of those types, Ficino and all of those types, Poland would say, oi, don't forget about our Renaissance sage, the great astronomer Copernicus, and they'd be perfectly right. But Copernicus was the one who created the great revolution that upset the Vatican, upset the world, because he's the one who really discovered that the planets of the solar system move around the sun. So that was called the first Copernican revolution. And some smart aleck realized that when they're looking at what Kant was doing, they called it a second Copernican revolution. And to explain that, let's go to the second slide. To explain that, we've got to realize that there was a traditional order when it comes to the categorization of subjects within philosophy, with metaphysics always being the top one, the most important one, epistemology being next to that, not so important, and then you may have moral philosophy, ethics, and now it's not called that. It's called political science. One could have a long story about why that even changed from moral philosophy to political science, but we'll leave that aside for now. And then finally, in fourth last place was aesthetics. So metaphysics always ruled the day for hundreds of years. And when you talk about most philosophers, especially big ones like Plato and Aristotle and Leibniz, and people like that, and even Descartes, you're speaking of metaphysicians. And epistemology is kind of there. Episteme is actually a Greek word, so it's been there from the time of Plato, and it really means belief. One interpretation of episteme is belief, but what it really has come down to is meaning knowledge. And how do I gain knowledge? And the means by which I know things. And how do I know those things? I know things, and how do I know things? So epistemology comes under that slightly different category. Metaphysics is what you know about universe, about meaning of life, about God, about purpose, about human existence. You see all those questions. How many angels can fit on the head of a pin? You'd be amazed where metaphysics ends up going. Lots of interesting things there. And also, like we've said before, when we dealt with the religious types, how this shook their world. As long as metaphysics reigned supreme as the top category, you basically got your religious types, your theological types in supremacy. They're okay with metaphysics, right? Because, in fact, they've set themselves up. In philosophy, religion is really metaphysics. Theology and metaphysics go together because they're the ones who've offered explanations. Like, for instance, the story of good and evil, how that came into the world, and moral turpitude, and how the sin may have come into the world, and all of that, right? So metaphysicians are fine. Theologians, they have nothing to worry about as long as metaphysics is on the table. And up until the time of Kant, it really was in the pride of place. Few exceptions, right? But basically, metaphysics rules the world up until Immanuel Kant's period of time. Although he would say he was shaken up by a previous philosopher called David Hume, but we're not going to go into that. That he got out of his metaphysical doldrums and the whole dogmatic view of life because of the works of the Scottish philosopher David Hume. But what did he do? What is the second Copernican revolution? It is the removal of the importance of metaphysics in place of epistemology. Kant is the one who really opened the new territory and said that, look, what has been missing in philosophy, what has been missing in psychology, in the metaphysics, is a deep inquiry into the I, the person who is asking these questions. Because for hundreds of years, right, going back to Plato and even the pre-Socratics, the person who is asking the great metaphysical questions has not been really part of the metaphysics. And so this turned things around, or turned things on its head, and opened the modern world. And so he is the one who then really is pleading the case for the centrality of the I, the questioner. So later on, when you hear somebody like Nietzsche saying God is dead, very famous statement. A lot of people think that that's the statement that opened the West. No, it's not. God is dead is a flashy, catchy, high-profile reiteration of what Kant had already said. Metaphysics is dead. And epistemology, the knower, the one who believes, the one who has opinions, the one who forms thoughts, the one who questions, is now the center. So God is dead, to a true student of philosophy, is just a nod to Kant, who really said God is dead, but in a slightly different way. In that metaphysical questions now are secondary. Metaphysics is still important, but it's far less important than inquiring into the self who asks the questions. And that means even neurologically, what is a brain? Neurology, neuroscience comes out of Kant, comes out of epistemology, not metaphysics, and many other things to come out of that as well, as we'll see as we go. So this extraordinary 18th century thinker has literally turned philosophy around, and they call it the second Copernican revolution. As important as discovery in science, in astronomy, in cosmology, that the planets actually orbit the sun, not the sun orbiting the planets. That's how philosophers thought of this as being important. And the Neo-Kantians always, to justify their own existence, you see, will always point to this. Much more than even his normal idealism, which is taking pot shots, and might not be the strongest ground for them to advocate. But this one they'll advocate. This one, Neo-Kantians would always go to it's our master, it's our sage that turned everything around and put the center of tension on the individual. And this is why, as we said in the previous programs, that Fichte took this up. Fichte is a Neo-Kantian to the degree that he took this really, really seriously and positioned the I, the ich, right, the self, in the center as the first principle. Then come along these romantics, and they say, yeah, okay, right, yeah, but this is not some monolithic, static I. If you remember the Led Zeppelin cover for Presence, it has this mysterious black obelisk that everybody's looking at on that cover. And I always think of that because Fichte's I is somewhat like that. It's big, it's adamantine, it's dark, it's stolid, and it's mysterious. But there it is. It's a reality, but it's mysterious. And the romantics are saying, no. The self will accept it as a first principle, but this thing is alive. This thing is active and needs to be expressed. So the romantics was the ones who, remember, said, forget the philosophy. It's not a first principle of philosophy that is really going to shake anybody up. But what it does tell us is that this I must be something that is understood through self-expression. And that's exactly what Europe heard, and that's exactly what Europe wanted. And we have the opening of the modern age, in which self-expression through writing, through speeches, through performance, through art. This will connect a little bit with what we're talking about, very much what we're talking about, poetry, manifestos. This is the era of the political manifesto. And so even though you may find in the political world somebody like a Karl Marx, and a Feuerbach, and anyone else you could really mention, certainly a Schopenhauer, a Nietzsche, all of these, Kierkegaard, they're all really romantics, far more than they're idealists. They are turned on by this. In fact, the younger you are, the more you're turned on by it. And even in their own day, people like Hegel were, very sympathetic with the romantic movement until later on they started to realize, no, you guys want to throw philosophy out and we don't. So the idealist says, we're accepting the I and the self and self-awareness, self-consciousness as the first principle, but we're still okay with the metaphysics. We're still going to continue as philosophers and not just, wild poets. And so things moved on, but the I is now firmly established, and then we move from there. So Kant's movement to kind of knock metaphysics off its perch and to put the I there. And so what does this mean? In the beginning, with your Fichtes and all, and certainly with Schelling, because he's the one who coined the term unconscious. Because now it was realized that the being we are needs to be investigated with as much gusto and with as much precision as the metaphysicians studied the cosmos, studied matter, studied phenomena, right? Came up with theories of. Now you can come up with theories of the self. What is it? And that's basically what you get with your Hegels and other people, which is a elaborate sort of proto-psychological, as I said, Schelling came up with the term the unconscious, to represent this internalization. The I, which is internal, now is a source of study for the very first time. Now, this is only, you could say, begins somewhere around 18